In Chapter 2, we'll be addressing three major concepts. The first will be how elements, atoms, and compounds are structured, how chemical bonds are formed and maintained, and water's life-supporting properties. Some of these concepts may be review from things that you learned in high school, while some of this material might be new to you. Before we get started, I'd like to first introduce a question. In this picture, you can see the vast array of wildlife and fish that live around coral reefs. How might a chemical compound in the air harm a coral reef? Why would that be something we would care about? Well, the answer to that question is chemistry. Carbon dioxide that's dissolved in water reacts with the water to form an acid, which in turn makes the water surrounding coral reefs more acidic. This leads to coral bleaching and eventually kills the reef, and is part of why controlling carbon dioxide emissions is so important for protecting the planet. This is also important because life's chemistry is tied to water. This is in part because life first evolved from the water, and cells consist of about 70% water. In this video, we will start by discussing elements, atoms, and compounds. Before we do, I'd like for you to think about what is a chemical. Anything that has mass, takes up space, is matter, and matter is comprised of chemicals. So essentially, everything around you is chemical. Generally, when we think of chemicals, we're referring to a chemical substance, which is usually pure or constant, something like a brick of sodium or a gallon of hydrochloric acid. Usually, when I ask students this question, the first thing that they think of is poisons, something that's toxic. In reality, any chemical could be a poison or toxic. You've probably heard the adage, dosage makes the poison, before. Did you know that water is toxic in high enough levels? We don't normally think of water as a poison, but if you drink too much of it, you can actually die from drinking too much. There are two types of danger that can be associated with chemicals. They are acute exposure, which is the maximum safe amount you can encounter all at once. For example, you should not drink more than 2 gallons of water at a time, versus chronic or prolonged exposure. The buildup in the body over time exceeds safe amounts. Water would never kill you or hurt you through chronic or prolonged exposure, but it could hurt you through acute exposure. Conversely, things like arsenic or cyanide could build up in your system at small levels over time and cause damage, or they could harm you through acute exposure if you got a lot at once. So chemicals are everywhere around you, and what makes a chemical dangerous is the way in and frequency at which it is encountered. Some of you might be wondering why we're talking about chemistry when we're not taking a chemistry class. Unfortunately, chemistry is related to biology in very specific ways. The first is that organisms are composed of elements, usually combined into compounds. Remember that living organisms are composed of matter and that matter itself is composed of chemical elements. There are about 25 elements that are essential for human life, but 4 of these elements make up about 96% of the weight of most living organisms. Those elements are oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. These elements are further combined into compounds, which are substances consisting of 2 or more different elements in a fixed ratio. What I mean by that is the same number of elements are going to be included to make the same compound. For example, water is always H2O. Any change to the number of H's or O's, hydrogens or oxygens, would make it not be water anymore. The ratio of atoms in a compound are responsible for that compound's properties. This is related to the idea of emergent properties. Remember, these are properties that arise only through the collaborative function or relationships of a system. This means that the parts of the system do not have the same properties as the whole. For example, if you take hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide, a strong acid and a strong base respectively, and mix them together, you would get salt and water. Both hydrochloric acid and sodium hydroxide are not safe to drink. They would seriously injure you. But salt water is pretty safe to consume. Another example is the production of table salt. Sodium is an explosive metal and chlorine is a noxious gas. Both of these things would be unsafe for you to consume. However, when they are mixed together, they form sodium chloride, which is normal table salt. Perfectly safe and rather delicious. Hopefully, I've convinced you that basic chemistry is important for understanding biology because biological organisms are made up of compounds, and compounds often have emergent properties. So now let's talk about how compounds are formed in the first place. To start, we have to think about atoms. Atoms consist of protons, neutrons, and electrons, and each element consists of a single type of atom. An atom is the smallest unit of matter that can still retain the properties of an element. Neutrons and protons are packed into the atom's nucleus, while electrons orbit the nucleus. For example, in the picture here, you can see that the nucleus contains 2 protons and 2 neutrons, while 2 electrons orbit the outside. The unique number of protons is an element's atomic number. This number can also be thought of as the atom's identity. An atom's mass number is the sum of the number of protons and neutrons in the nucleus and is an approximation of the atom's weight, or atomic mass. Isotopes of an element have the same number of protons but different numbers of neutrons. Let's talk about an example. Carbon is an incredibly common atom, and the most common form of carbon is carbon-12. 99% of all carbon exists in this form. Here, the number of protons, which is 6, is equal to the number of neutrons, also 6, giving carbon-12 a mass number of 12. However, there are 2 other versions of carbon that also exist, carbon-13 and carbon-14. Both of these isotopes of carbon have more neutrons than the standard carbon-12. They are still carbon because the number of protons that are present is 6, and this determines the identity and basic properties of the atom. You may have heard of carbon-14 before. Carbon-14 is a radioactive isotope. Radioactivity is the emission of ionizing radiation by the disintegration of an atomic nuclei. That's a lot of words, so what does that actually mean? What it means is that when there are too many neutrons in an atom, an electron can decay and release energy. This causes a neutron to become a proton. For example, carbon-14 often goes through this process, losing a beta particle, what's left of an electron, and converting one of its neutrons into a new proton. When this happens, it changes the numbers from 6 protons and 8 neutrons, which is unstable, to 7 protons and 7 neutrons, which is stable. Because the number of protons has changed, the identity of the atom has changed from carbon, which has 6 protons, to nitrogen, which has 7, even though the mass number has not changed. Radioactive decay, or the process through which one of these atoms converts, occurs in a predictable way. For example, we can use the amount of carbon-14 that remains in an object versus the amount of nitrogen that is present to determine how old something is. So carbon-14 is often used to date objects and artifacts from the ancient past. Radioactive isotopes like iodine-131 are often used to treat medical problems. We can actually detect the radioactive decay of these objects inside of an organism. So sometimes you might be asked to consume one of these things before you are put into a monitor. Low amounts of energy released through this type of radioactive decay are relatively safe, but it's a good idea not to have too many of these tests at a time. Radioactive substances, because they release energy, can cause damage to cells and molecules in your body, and that's part of why it's a good idea to only use them when you need to.